There are restaurants in this world where the wine list is longer than most people's CVs, and the waiting list is longer still. Auberge Sainte-Cécile was that kind of place. Tucked into a narrow Victorian row house on a cobblestone street in Old Montreal, it seated 42 people on any given evening. Never 43, never 41. The reservation waitlist ran 8 months. The prix-fixe menu changed weekly, sourced from 3 farms in the eastern townships, whose owners had been supplying the kitchen for longer than most of the current staff had been alive. There was no sign above the door. Regulars knew where it was. Everyone else wasn't supposed to. Margot Tessier had worked there for 3 years. From the outside, that fact said very little about her. A young woman in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back in the precise low chignon that head server Fournier required of all female staff, black apron tied cleanly at the waist. She carried herself quietly, moved through the dining room without brushing a single chair, and had a habit of arriving 12 minutes before her shift began to review the evening's menu notes. The kitchen staff liked her because she asked real questions. Not what's the garnish, but what's the acid doing in the sauce, and how does it change if a guest has red wine with it? She had opinions on texture. She noticed things. The other servers mostly assumed she was a lifer. Smart girl, good memory, no real ambition beyond a steady paycheck. It was an easy assumption to make. It was also completely wrong. What Margot had was a degree. Almost. 18 months short of completing her master's in international commerce at McGill, she had sat in a meeting with her academic advisor and known, even before the words came out of her mouth, that she was going to ask for a leave of absence. Her mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's the previous winter. Her father worked in construction and had already taken a second job. Her younger brother was 16 and needed stability, more than he needed Margot in a lecture hall. She told herself it was temporary. She had believed it once. That was 4 years ago. The leave had turned into a withdrawal, quietly, over the course of a single administrative email she had sent on a Tuesday afternoon without letting herself re-read it. She had found the job at Auberge Sainte-Cécile through a friend of a friend. The hours suited her schedule around her mother's appointments. The pay was better than people assumed. Fournier ran a serious house, and the gratuities reflected it. And there was something about the work itself that suited the part of Margot's brain that had always wanted to be useful, wanted to read a room, wanted to understand what people needed before they knew how to ask for it. She had never told Fournier about the degree. She had never told anyone at the restaurant. It wasn't a secret exactly. It just hadn't come up, and she had never gone looking for a moment to introduce it. On the evening of the 23rd of October, she was assigned to Table 7. The reservation had been made under the name Hargreave, which meant nothing to Margot until she caught Fournier's expression when the party was shown in. A slight tightening around the jaw, the kind that on anyone else might have been invisible, but on Fournier, who had the emotional range of a diplomat in public, was practically a grimace. She understood why, within about 90 seconds, Conrad Hargreave was not a man who entered rooms quietly. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, in the way that suggested he had been athletic once and had since replaced muscle with the particular confidence of wealth. He wore a dark blazer over a charcoal turtleneck. No tie, no watch. The studied casualness of someone who wanted you to know he didn't need to perform. His hair was silver at the temples, and he had left it slightly long, just enough to suggest he made his own rules about these things. He ran Hargreave Capital, one of the larger private equity firms in Toronto. Margot knew this not because she followed finance news, but because one of the other servers, Pascal, had recognized the name when the reservation came through 2 weeks earlier, and had mentioned it in the staff room with the particular mixture of reverence and anxiety that certain guests inspired. Hargreave had a reputation, not a criminal one, not exactly, but the kind of reputation that preceded a man into rooms he hadn't yet entered. He was known for being demanding. He was known for making scenes when his demands weren't met, which he was careful to frame as standards. He had with him 4 other people, 2 men from his firm, who laughed at things a half-second after he said them, a junior associate who kept her eyes on her menu, and seemed to be managing her breathing with some deliberateness, and a woman across the table named Sylvie Beaumont, no relation to the Claire in the file, who was, based on the way Hargreave twice interrupted himself to glance at her reaction, the actual reason for the dinner. She was the CFO of a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company based in Laval, and she was considering a significant partnership arrangement with Hargreave Capital. She was evaluating him as much as the deal. Anyone paying attention could see this. Hargreave, to his credit, seemed to sense it too. He was performing tonight. Margot introduced herself, described the evening's menu, a 7-course tasting with optional wine pairings built around late-harvest ingredients from Ile d'Orléans, and asked whether anyone had dietary restrictions. "We'll do the full menu," Hargreave said, before anyone else could answer. He hadn't looked up from the wine list. "All of us. Tell the kitchen not to hold back on the portions. I know how these places portion." He said the last phrase with a particular smile, directed at the table in general, that implied both familiarity with fine dining and a mild contempt for it. "Of course," Margot said. "The first course will come out in about, and I'd like to speak to someone about the Burgundy selection." He finally looked up. His gaze was the kind that measured. "Your 2015 Gevrey Chambertin. Is that the Rossignol Trappet, or are we talking something else?" "The Rossignol Trappet Premier Cru," Margot said. "The Les Corbeaux. It's been open for 40 minutes. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He hadn't expected that answer, delivered that quickly, with that specificity. "Good," he said. He went back to the list. The first 2 courses passed without incident. Margot noticed that Hargreave ate with real attention. He was not whatever else he was, a man who wasted food or failed to taste it. The Ile d'Orléans duck, confit in the 2nd course, earned a nod she suspected was genuine. Sylvie Beaumont was warmer than her position at the table suggested, asking thoughtful questions about the provenance of the produce, the kind of questions that indicated she had grown up somewhere with a garden. Then came the 3rd course, and the moment that would later strike Margot as the one where everything changed. Hargreave had been telling a story, something about a deal in Zurich, delivered in the practiced cadences of a man who told it often, when he paused, looked up at Margot as she set down the amuse-bouche and said something. Not in French, not in English, in Michif. It was a request, or at least it was structured like one. Michif is a Creole language, part Cree, part French, historically spoken by Métis communities across the Canadian prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, reaching into parts of Quebec and the northern United States. It is not a language you stumble across. There are fewer than 1,000 fluent speakers remaining. Most Canadians have never encountered a sentence of it in their lives. Hargreave had picked it up, she would learn later, from an extended period of time he had spent in Manitoba, in his late 30s during an infrastructure acquisition. A local elder had taught him a handful of phrases at a community meeting he had attended for appearances. He had retained them as a curiosity, a party trick. He was asking her. She passed it in the half-second it took her to set down the last plate, whether she could bring him something that wasn't on the menu. He was smiling, not at her. At the table, the 2 associates were already suppressing grins. The junior associate's eyes were on her plate. Sylvie Beaumont was watching with an expression that was carefully neutral, but not unkind. The joke, if you could call it that, was this. He had asked her something she couldn't possibly understand, in a language she had no reason to know, in front of a table of witnesses. Her confusion would be the entertainment. Her flustered, apologetic, "I'm sorry, I don't," would be the punchline. It was the kind of move that required an audience to land, and he had one. 5 faces, including the woman whose opinion he was trying to impress. Margot looked at him. She answered him in mischief. Not perfectly, she would be the first to say that. Her mischief had been acquired through a very specific set of circumstances. 2 years into her degree at McGill, she had taken an elective course in Indigenous language preservation as part of a broader certificate program, taught by a professor named Dr. Annette Swifthawk, who was one of perhaps 60 people in Canada with active academic fluency in the language. Margot had found the coursework extraordinary. She had continued past the requirement. She had done her final paper on the phonological shifts that occurred when Michif communities migrated westward in the 19th century. She was not a fluent speaker, but she knew enough to hear what he had said, and she knew enough to respond. What she said in Michif was approximately, "I can ask the kitchen, but the chef would want to know what you have in mind." The silence at table 7 lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Hargreaves' smile did not disappear so much as it reconfigured, the muscles holding it up rearranging themselves into something that no longer knew what shape it was supposed to take. One of the associates let out a sound that was almost a laugh and then caught itself. Sylvie Beaumont set down her fork. Not loudly. "But did you learn that?" "Where did you level?" Hargreaves said. To his credit, he kept it level. "McGill," Margot said. "Indigenous language studies as part of a commerce degree." Long story. She shifted her attention to the table as a whole, professionally, cleanly. "Is there something off menu you'd like me to check on with the kitchen?" Chef Pelletier is usually open to it, depending on what we have available. "Commerce," Sylvie Beaumont said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the word turned over in someone's hands. "I was studying international commerce," Margot said. "I took a leave of absence a few years ago. Family situation, I haven't finished." "Yet," Sylvie Beaumont said. Margot looked at her. "Yet?" she agreed. Hargreaves said nothing. He picked up his wineglass. He drank. The 2 associates had gone quiet in the way of men who understood that the geometry of the room had shifted and were working out what it meant for them. The remainder of the service passed with a different quality. Hargreave was not, to be precise, chastened. Men like him did not do chastened, not visibly, not in the middle of a dinner they were using to close a deal. But something in him had recalibrated. The performance element was gone, or at least reduced. He ate the remaining courses with less commentary. He asked Margot at one point about the grain-fed bison in the 5th course, and the question was a real one. She answered it as a real question. He nodded. Sylvie Beaumont, on the other hand, had come alive. She asked about the farms. She asked how long Margot had been at the restaurant. She asked, in a careful way that was clearly not casual, whether Margot had considered going back to finish the degree. Margot said she had thought about it. The financing was the obstacle, and her mother still needed somewhat in the last port, though things had stabilized somewhat in the last year. "What was your concentration?" Sylvie asked. "Trade regulation and international supply chains," Margot said. "Specifically pharmaceutical distribution. Actually, I did my 3rd-year research project on cross-border drug pricing between Canada and the US." The pause this created was specific. Sylvie Beaumont ran a pharmaceutical distribution company. The regulatory landscape Margot had just named was her daily reality. The research Margot had described was, in a narrow but meaningful way, directly relevant to the exact sector Sylvie worked in. "You're kidding me," Sylvie said quietly. "I have the paper somewhere," Margot said. "I got a pretty good mark on it." Sylvie looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket, a well-cut charcoal blazer, the kind that meant she wore it often enough to have broken it in properly, and produced a business card. "Send me the paper," she said, "and your CV, if you have one." Margot took the card. It was heavy stock. The name on it read Sylvie Beaumont, CFO Apex Pharma Distribution Inc. Below the name, a Montreal address. "I will," Margot said. She tucked the card into the small pocket of her apron, the one where she kept a pen and a folded piece of paper for noting special requests. Then she went to check on the dessert course. Fournier caught her near the service station afterward, when the table had been given its cheese course and had a window of quiet. He was a small, precise man in his 60s who had worked in fine dining for 4 decades and had long ago lost the capacity to be surprised by anything that happened in a dining room. But he had been watching Table 7 with a particular attention this evening, and his expression now held something that in someone else might have been curiosity. "What happened at 7?" he said. "The guest made a remark in an unusual language," Margot said. "I happen to understand it." Fournier looked at her for a moment. "Michif," he said. "I recognized a word." Margot looked at him, surprised. "I grew up in Manitoba," he said simply. "A long time ago." He straightened a napkin on the service station. "Go check on 7. She went. Hargreaves' party settled the bill at 10:30. The total was, by Auberge Sainte-Cécile standards, unremarkable. The gratuity was 50%, which was not unremarkable. It was almost unheard of. Margot was clearing the glassware when she noticed the folded paper on the edge of the table, next to where Hargreave had been sitting. It wasn't a note exactly. It was a business card, face down, with 2 words written in a heavy hand on the back. "Good answer." She stood there for a moment holding the card, the cleared glasses around her, the dining room going quiet as the last table finished their coffee. She thought about her mother's apartment in Rosemont, where a pill organizer sat on the kitchen counter in 7 compartments, and her father came by every other day. She thought about the research paper on pharmaceutical supply chains printed and filed in a binder under her bed because she hadn't known what else to do with it. She thought about Dr. Annette Swifthawk, who had told her at the end of the language preservation course that Margot had the kind of mind that didn't stay still, and that it would figure out what it was supposed to be doing eventually. She put the card in her pocket with Sylvie Beaumont's. She finished clearing the table. 3 days later, she sent Sylvie Beaumont an email. She attached the research paper, 42 pages, annotated bibliography, a methodological appendix she had been privately proud of. She attached a CV that she had spent 2 evenings reconstructing, filling in the years at Auberge Sainte-Cécile under professional experience without apology, describing what she had actually learned there. Service under pressure, reading complex social dynamics, operational knowledge of high-end food and wine procurement, client relationship management in an environment where the margin for error was essentially 0. She almost deleted the last paragraph of her cover letter 3 times. It said that she was not currently enrolled in her degree, but intended to finish it, and that she was aware her path had been unconventional, and that she believed her work experience had given her a practical grounding that she could not have gotten in a classroom, and that she was interested in a conversation if Sylvie thought her background was relevant. She sent it on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment in Plateau Mont-Royal, her mother asleep in the next room. She didn't hear back that week. She heard back on the Monday. The email was 3 sentences. The first sentence said that Sylvie had read the paper and found it sharp. The second sentence said that she had circulated it to her regulatory affairs team, who had independently called it well-researched. The third sentence proposed a call that Wednesday at 11. Margot read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she opened her laptop and looked up the McGill Continuing Education Office and the requirements for completing a leave of absence withdrawal and how long it would take. The call on Wednesday lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Sylvie asked real questions, the kind that assumed Margot knew what she was talking about, which was different from the way most people had questioned her in the last 4 years. She asked about the specific trade corridors Margot had examined in her research. She asked about a particular federal regulation that had changed in 2022 and wanted to know Margot's read on the downstream effects. Margot had thoughts. She shared them. Sylvie pushed back on 2 points, and Margot pushed back on the pushback, calmly, with the specific language of someone who had actually spent time in the primary literature. At the end of the call, Sylvie said that Apex was expanding its regulatory affairs division and that they were looking for someone who could sit between the legal team and speak both languages. Not literally, though she added, with what Margot was beginning to recognize as her version of dry humor, that the midchief hadn't hurt. "The role would require you to finish the degree," Sylvie said. "We'd support that. There's a professional development arrangement we have with 2 universities. The position itself would be part-time to start, scaling up as you complete the program." "What's the timeline for the part-time?" Margot said. 6 months. If it works, full-time after that." Margot looked at the wall of her apartment. There was a print there that her mother had given her, years ago, a Krieghoff reproduction, a winter scene with a farmhouse and a yellow light in the window. She had looked at it so many times she mostly didn't see it anymore. "Can I have a few days to think about it?" she said. "Of course," Sylvie said. "Take the week." She told her mother that evening. Her mother was having a good day, the kind where her hands were steadier, and her words came without the slight hesitation that had become familiar. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when Margot came in, and she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was her way. When Margot finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. "The man tried to embarrass you," she said finally, "in front of everyone." "He did," Margot said, "and it went the other way." "It did." Her mother wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Tell me about the woman." So Margot told her about Sylvie Beaumont, the way she had set her fork down when Hargreaves' trick backfired, the deliberate quality of that small gesture, the business card on heavy stock, the email that arrived on Monday, the call, the offer. Her mother listened. When Margot finished, she said, "Are you going to take it?" Margot thought about the research paper under her bed. She thought about 42 pages nobody had read in 3 years. She thought about Dr. Swifthawk's voice saying it will figure out what it's supposed to be doing. "I think I am." Her mother reached across the table and covered Margot's hand with her own. Her grip was lighter than it used to be, but it was there. She accepted the position on a Friday. She re-enrolled in the McGill Continuing Education program the following Tuesday. The administrator she spoke to, a patient woman who had clearly handled many returned students, found her file in the system almost immediately, noted that her academic record was strong, and said that with the credits she had completed, she would need approximately 3 semesters to finish. 3 semesters, Margot said. "If you stay on track, I'll stay on track." She walked home from the McGill campus through the October cold, past the orange-leaved maples on Sherbrooke, past the cafe she had sat in during her first degree, past the bus stop where she had once stood for 40 minutes in a February storm, because she'd missed her connection and hadn't minded, because she'd been rereading a trade policy brief she found genuinely interesting. The city looked the same. She felt, specifically and without drama, like herself. She gave Fournier her notice the following week. He accepted it without ceremony, which was his way. He asked when her last shift would be and noted it in his book. Then he looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, with the expression of a man who had seen many things in dining rooms across several decades, and had formed views about most of them. "The woman at 7, he said. "Beaumont. Yes, good." He closed his book. "You were wasted here, Tessier. You were good at it, which is not the same thing." It was the longest personal statement she had ever heard him make. She thanked him. He waved it off and went back to his reservations list. As for Conrad Hargreave, she learned, some weeks later through a piece of Montreal business news that Sylvie mentioned in passing, that the partnership negotiations between Hargreave Capital and Apex Pharma Distribution had not concluded successfully. The details were not public, but Sylvie, with that same dry precision, noted that due diligence had turned up certain considerations about the firm's approach to stakeholder relations. Margot did not ask her to elaborate. She had a regulatory briefing to prepare for a Wednesday meeting. She had a seminar paper due in her trade law course. She had a Sunday lunch to get to in Rosemont, where her father was making tourtière, and her brother, 20 years old now, finishing a welding apprenticeship, taller than anyone in the family expected, would be there with his girlfriend. She had, in other words, quite a lot going on. The pill organizer on her mother's kitchen counter still had 7 compartments. The Krieghoff print was still on the wall of her apartment. Some things didn't change, and you learned to be grateful for the ones that didn't. But the research paper was no longer under her bed. It was cited now in a regulatory affairs memo that had gone to the Apex board. Dr. Annette Swifthawk had received a copy in the mail with a note that said simply, "It figured it out." MT. The professor had written back 4 words. "I knew it would.